One thing that I have noticed is that there are Jews who are sympathetic with Hamas. Yes, they exist. Not every single Jew is a staunch supporter of Israel. You actually have Jews who sympathize with Hamas, and they will even get giddy about Hamas killing Israelis. I've actually seen this. I saw this today. I posted a clip of it in one of my recent videos. Norman Finkelstein, probably the most well-known Jewish scholar who sympathizes with the Gazan cause, and he has been doing it for decades. And Norman Finkelstein recently did an interview in which he talked about the slaughter of the Jews. And he will say, I condemn. But then he will get giddy while talking about the massacre, talking about the Hamas terrorists killing Israelis. Yes, he actually will get giddy. He says he said in this interview, it was an orgy of vengeance. Yes, and it was an orgy of vengeance. And you look at his eyes. I mean, the guy looks like a demon in human form. This guy looks demonically possessed. Play the clip.
It was an orgy of vengeance. It was an orgy of vengeance, which I think was true. It was born of that chasm between who they were, who they aspired to be, and this hapless fate of being born into slavery or born into a concentration camp. If that sounds like, the French expression, to understand is to excuse. If that sounds like excusing, well, guess what? Excuse me, but I think it's the truth.
And just look at this guy's face. Look at him getting all excited. The guy gets giddy. He's smiling with this sadistic grin. He looks like, Marquise de Sade. I mean, he looks sick, this person. He looks absolutely sick. And he's saying, it was an orgy of vengeance. It was an orgy of vengeance. It was an orgy. It's like talking about some Charlie Manson massacre where you have terrorists going into random families' homes and slaughtering them and calling it an orgy of vengeance by people who were just tired of living under occupation. Do you know who made the same types of arguments? It was the Ukrainian nationalist who butchered the Polish people. The Ukrainian nationalists who collaborated with the Nazis made the same types of arguments. Oh, the Poles, they've been occupying us. Oh, the Poles, they control most of the land. Oh, the Poles, they have made a lot of the Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian Orthodox churches, into Polish Catholic churches. Oh, so therefore we are justified to commit the most outrageous, most egregious crimes, most horrific, sadistic crimes you can imagine. And yes, you can look up the Volyn massacre and you will see that the crimes perpetrated against the Polish people during the Second World War was just an utter nightmare. Absolutely horrific. But here you have a Jewish person, Norman Finkelstein, getting giddy, getting excited while talking about Jews being killed. And you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the Jewish Civil War. You have Jews who don't mind or who enjoy seeing other Jews being killed by terrorists. And it reminds me of Josephus's history of the Roman Jewish War. You see, when you open up Josephus's history on the Roman Jewish War, you would expect to read about Jews fighting Romans, right? Because it's the Roman Jewish War, so it's Jews fighting Romans. When I opened up that book, which is one of the best books I've ever read, I expected to read about Jews fighting Romans. I did not expect for most of the book to be about Jews killing each other. But that's really how the book is. For the most part, the book is about the Jews killing one another. Jews going door to door, slaughtering entire Jewish families. And yes, Josephus describes these crimes. And he describes the perpetrators as monsters. He describes them as just absolutely, utterly evil people. And they killed those Jews because those Jews did not want to have a war with the Romans. And what you have in the Jewish world is you have Jews who sympathize with the Gazan cause, some of whom to the point where they will get giddy about Jews being slaughtered, like Norman Finkelstein. And you have on the other side, in the tension, in this struggle, Jews who hate the other Jews for being sympathetic to the Arabs to the point where they wouldn't mind killing those Jews. So, and they will say that those Jews, those more liberal Jews, are not real Jews. And so you have this struggle between the Jews. And the fact that you have Jews who sympathize with Hamas and don't really care about Jews being killed, or are indifferent, or take pleasure in the fact of Jews being killed, shows us that it's entirely possible that the Jews will kill one another. In fact, I believe that it is imminent. I think in the future there will be a civil war between the Jews, that they will kill each other. Because as much as there is tension between the Jews and the Arabs, there is also a tremendous amount of tension between the Jews themselves. And we saw this before the outbreak of the war, before the October 7th massacre. There were tremendous demonstrations in Israel, all over Israel. There were these demonstrations, huge crowds, where you would have, I think, around 100,000 or so people on the streets of Tel Aviv, protesting against Netanyahu, calling for him to step down from office. And so there was tremendous tension between the Jews, and it's still there. It's still there. And I remember reading about the pogroms that took place back in 2021 when you had Jewish fanatics attacking Arabs. And I remember reading about how Jewish fanatics attacked a Jewish-owned restaurant because that restaurant had non-Jewish customers, had Arab customers or tourist non-Jewish customers, and they were overthrowing the chairs and they were breaking the windows. And that was just an example of this hatred and how deep it goes and how real it is. It's very real. It's very real. And so when I see Norman Finkelstein getting excited about Jews being killed, it just reminds me of Josephus. It reminds me of what Josephus wrote when he described the Jews killing one another. You have Jews who wouldn't mind killing other Jews or seeing other Jews being slaughtered. And they'll sit there and they'll say, well, we sympathize, we sympathize with the Gazan cause. And the biggest snakes are these people who say, I condemn what Hamas did. I condemn all atrocities. And what's happening to the Gazan people is it's a war crime, everybody. It's terrible. It's genocide. It's awful. I mean, those people have nothing to do with what Hamas did. That was the actions of Hamas. And it's like, well, wait a second. This is the Gazan population is who voted for Hamas. And even according to Norman Finkelstein, it was a completely democratic election in which Hamas won. Hamas was legitimately, democratically elected. Oh, okay. So the people voted for a terrorist organization. Well, not everybody in Gaza supports Hamas. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, you're right. Not everybody in Gaza supports Hamas. You have people in Gaza who support even more fanatical factions than Hamas. For example, and this is a report that came out recently from the Fikra Forum, and this is a part of the Washington Institute. And look at what it says here. Check this out. This is crazy. Check this out. So it talks about support for Hamas amongst the Gazans, and then it says, but it is organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Lion's Den that receive the most widespread popular support in Gaza. About 3/4 of Gazans express support for both groups. So 3 out of every 4 Gazans support Palestinian Islamic Jihad. 3 out of every 4 Gazans supports Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They support ISIS. 3/4. 3 out of every 4. Now, if 3 out of every 4 Americans, let's be more specific here. Let's make it more demographic. Because, in America, there is this obsession about white America, how white Americans are so evil, white people. Imagine if 3 out of every 4 white Americans supported the Nazi Party or the KKK. The far right, guys, the rise of the far right taking over. Oh my God, this is terrible, right? And I don't know, Native Americans decided to attack white people because white people stole their land. Well, they did steal their land. Oh, they did steal their land. I mean, if Native Americans decided to kill white people because white people back in the past took over, and thank God they did. Would these same idiots think that those Native Americans are justified? They probably would. But the fact is, going back to Gaza, 3 out of every 4 Gazans support Islamic Jihad. 3 out of 4. And the one that doesn't most likely is lying. They just don't want to say who they actually support, but they probably do support either Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Lion's Den. So 3 out of 4 of every Gazans. So if you meet 4 Gazans, 3 of them will openly support Islamic Jihad or Lion's Den. So the more fanatical factions in Gaza are the ones growing in popularity, and they're getting the widespread popular support in Gaza. So it's not just a terrorist state. Gaza is not just a terrorist state. Gaza is a terrorist society. And I'm so sick and tired of all the people who sit there and say, well, we have, while what was done on October the 7th was wrong, we have to think about what was going on, before that. I mean, those people are living in an open air prison, and they've been living in such a way for decades, and we have to factor that in. Well, if you want to go that route, I mean, I would ask the question, why are those people in an open air prison? What's going on there? There's something wrong with that society. Oh, Israel! It's Israel. They did a blockade. They control the water. They do a blockade. Well, do you know which other country does a blockade? Egypt. Egypt has been doing a blockade on Gaza for decades. Egypt has a blockade on Gaza, and Egypt supports the blockade. So how come the Gazans don't go down to Egypt and slaughter Egyptian citizens? And the reason why the Egyptians don't want the Gazans is because the Gazans are freaking insane, and they're Muslim Brotherhood. The government of Egypt suffered enough with the Muslim Brotherhood. Remember the Muslim Brotherhood almost took over Egypt? Remember that back in 2011 when Obama was president? The Muslim Brotherhood almost took over Egypt. Remember, it was Mohammed Morsi, and everybody was losing their minds. And thank God there was a coup backed by Russia. Pretty certain it was backed by Russia. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. But thank God there was a coup that stopped that guy from taking power. And everybody was losing their minds about the prospect of Mohammed Morsi winning an election and taking over. And they did take over. They actually did. I said prevent. They actually did take over. And then there was a coup that overthrew them. That coup prevented them from further being in power. But there's a reason why people were freaking out about that. It's because those people are terrorists. They're insane. They're Islamic lunatics. They're cultists. It's like having Jamestown or Jonestown. Sorry, it's like having Jonestown as a country. So that's the reason why the Egyptians want a blockade over Gaza. Egypt also has a blockade on Gaza. Egypt shares a border with Gaza, and the Egyptians don't want the Gazans. How come the Egyptians don't want the Gazans? And how come the Gazans don't go into Egypt and kill Egyptians like they did the Israelis? And if the Gazans killed a bunch of Egyptians, killed a thousand Egyptians or thousands of Egyptians, I'm pretty certain that Egypt wouldn't mind bombing Gaza. But because Israel does it, it's all of a sudden a big deal, which really goes to show that there is a rising hatred against Jews, and there's a rising hatred against Israelis. It's really quite clear. And they'll sit there and talk about, oh, there was a blockade, and oh yeah, there's this occupation, and it's so terrible. And so the reason why the massacre was so terrible, according to Norman Finkelstein, the reason why the massacre was so terrible was because of the occupation. That's the reason why the occupation is so bad. So the massacre is just as bad, right? Or the massacre was so bad because the occupation is so bad. Well, it's very interesting. Christians living in the Roman Empire suffered tremendously. The suffering that Christians endured in the pagan Roman Empire was way worse than anything that the Gazans have been going through. People being fed to the lions, being fed to bears, people being burned alive, people going through a gauntlet, being tortured to death. I mean, all sorts of horrific things, being skinned alive, like all sorts of horrific things happened to Christians under the tyranny of pagan Rome. And the Christians never committed a massacre like this. There weren't any Christian terrorists committing massacres. The Christians were people who would never support the massacre of children, rape, or beheadings, or anything crazy like that. They would never support what the Gazans support. And who took over the empire? Who took over the empire? The Christians took over the empire eventually. Why? Because they're civil. The Christians were civilized, and they brought civilization. The Gazans, they're just mad about the fact that you have kuffars ruling over them. That's the bottom line. Because Egypt also has a blockade on them, and they don't care about that. But they're mad about the fact that you have Jews who are in a position that's over them, or that the Israeli government has some kind of power over them, and they're just mad about that. And so they use that to justify the most horrific, atrocious crimes ever. And the Ukrainian nationalists did the same exact thing when they slaughtered the Poles. They said, well, the Poles, the Poland defeated Ukraine in a war, and so Poland took a bunch of territory for itself, like Lvov and East Galicia and all that stuff. So you had a bunch of ethnic Poles living amongst Ukrainians, and once the Germans took over Poland, the Germans took over those territories that the Ukrainians believed rightfully belonged to them. And by rightfully, I don't mean that they were correct. I mean, they believed that it rightfully belonged to them. Once the Germans took over Poland, that empowered the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians butchered the Poles with the backing of the German government. And the Ukrainians, they had the same types of arguments. Oh, they're occupiers. They occupy us. They took all this land from us. Blah 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 blah. And they raped and they scalped and they cut people to pieces and skinned people alive and did the most horrific things that you can imagine, and horrific things that you probably could not imagine. Who's going to look back and say, with Norman Finkelstein, that it was an orgy of vengeance? It was just people who there was this chasm between who those people could have been and a life of living in an open air concentration camp. It's just sickness. It's absolute sickness. It's sick. Another thing that I want to mention is this idea that, there needs to be peace talks right now. There needs to be calls for a ceasefire right now. It's like, what? What the hell are you talking about? You can't just go into another country, kill over 1,000 of its citizens, and then say, oh, let's have peace talks. Let's have peace talks, everybody. Peace. It reminds me of a story that I read in Julius Caesar's Gaul, his account of his conquest of Gaul. He talks about this tribe. I'm pretty certain it was one of those Germanian tribes. Regardless, he talks about this tribe that attacked his troops, and he talks about how right after the attack was done, the tribe that was responsible for the ambush sent some of its most prestigious citizens to go to Julius Caesar to tell him that the tribe had nothing to do with it, and it was just a lie. And it's a strategy. It's a strategy that criminals do. You'll see this in the police body cam footage. You'll have criminals who will do the most egregious acts, and then once the cops catch them, they go, "I surrender. I surrender." So they'll commit the most atrocious crimes, and then they don't want to die, so they just surrender. So you can't just commit the most atrocious crime and then expect not to get a punishment out of it. Like, there needs to be repercussions. And you can't just go into a country and then kill 1,400 people and then say, okay, let's have a negotiation. So it's what these people are saying is that the killers should dictate the terms. The killers should just, the killers can commit their crimes and then just call for negotiation. So basically you do mass murder to bring the other side to the table. That's what you're saying. That's what you're saying, that they kill people and then they should just have negotiations. And that Israel should just comply. Oh yes, we'll negotiate. Oh, absolutely. Yes, let's do a negotiation. What do you guys want? It's complete bullshit. If Mexico went into the United States and killed tens of thousands of American citizens, and then just automatically, right after the crime is committed, ask for the United States to come into the negotiation table, that would be complete garbage. It's like, yeah, we can just go into your country, kill tens of thousands of your people, and then say, okay, we're sorry, and let's have a negotiation. That's bullshit. That is bullshit.